I hike alone regularly, several times a month depending on the season, and know how to use a compass and a printed topo map competently without ever needing to rely on my phone. And on a solo trip through a national forest last spring, I picked a fixed compass bearing, due east, off an established trail specifically to test and sharpen my own navigation skills on flat, entirely unremarkable terrain with nothing tricky about it whatsoever, with no major obstacles marked anywhere on the map. Walked that exact bearing for just over 4 full hours by my own watch. Deliberate step after deliberate step, checking my compass every few minutes to correct for the natural drift the way I always discipline myself to do. And instead of covering the roughly 8 miles of new ground that bearing should have produced over that much time, ended up walking directly back into my own trailhead parking lot, my own car still sitting exactly where I'd left it, having somehow traveled in a straight line due east for over 4 hours, and returned to my precise starting point without ever once consciously turning around. I want to explain why this shouldn't be possible before I explain what actually happened, because the terrain itself matters enormously here. This wasn't mountainous country where switchbacks or unavoidable terrain features might force a hiker to curve their path without realizing it. It was flat, gently rolling forest, the kind of land where a compass bearing genuinely should hold for miles without any natural obstacle serious enough to meaningfully bend a deliberate straight line walk. I've done this exact kind of bearing exercise probably 30 times over the years in similar terrain, and I have never once, not before that specific day and not since, ended up anywhere except roughly where basic trigonometry always reliably said I should. Before I tell you what my GPS track actually showed when I finally looked at it, I want to ask you something, because I think this is the kind of detail that either terrifies you immediately or doesn't land until you really sit with it. If you walked in one fixed direction for 4 straight hours and ended up exactly back where you started, would you trust your compass, or would you start questioning something considerably bigger than a piece of broken equipment? Tell me honestly in the comments, because I've asked people this question a lot since it happened to me, and the answers genuinely split people right down the middle. Subscribe if you want the other 2 stories, because I think you're going to want to hear how closely they line up with mine. Now, the GPS track. I carry a GPS watch specifically as a backup to compass navigation, not something I typically rely on directly, but something that logs a continuous track I can review afterward, and later that same evening, still turning the whole thing over in my head. When I finally sat down and pulled up that day's full recorded path, expecting to see some kind of gentle, gradual curve I simply hadn't consciously noticed forming over 4 hours of walking, what I actually got was a track that ran essentially dead straight, due east, exactly the bearing I'd set, for just under 3.8 miles, and then simply stopped logging entirely for a gap of 46 minutes before resuming, dead straight, in the exact same easterly direction, for another short stretch before terminating directly back at my truck. I want to be specific about why that gap itself was so unusual, because I've reviewed plenty of GPS tracks from heavy tree cover over the years, and know exactly what normal signal interference actually looks like in the data. The watch hadn't lost signal in any way that matched its usual, familiar pattern for genuine tree cover interference, which typically produces jittery, wildly inconsistent points scattered around the true path, rather than one single, clean, total gap. This was a full 46 minutes of complete silence in the data, followed by a resumption exactly on the same bearing, as though the device itself had simply stopped existing for the better part of an hour before picking back up mid-stride. Still unsettled weeks later, and needing some kind of answer even if it turned out to be a boring one, I went back to that same trailhead about 3 weeks after the original hike, deliberately choosing full daylight this time, specifically to walk the exact same bearing again, but with a friend along for a second set of eyes, both of us checking each other's compass readings independently the entire way. And we made it, without incident, over 4 miles due east before hitting a fire road that matched exactly what the topo map predicted. No mysterious return to the trailhead this time, no unexplained gap anywhere in either of our tracks. Absolutely nothing unusual about the walk at all. meaning whatever had happened to me on that first solo attempt was either something specific to that particular day, that particular moment, or something that only happens to a hiker walking that stretch of forest completely alone. A distinction that has changed permanently. How comfortable I am hiking remote terrain completely alone, regardless of how many years of experience I have logged doing exactly that. I posted a stripped-down version of the story on a hiking forum a few months later, deliberately vague about the exact location, mostly just curious whether anyone else had experienced something similar, and got a handful of replies I genuinely didn't expect. Other solo hikers describing almost identical experiences in completely different forests across different states. Always the same core details: a fixed compass bearing, several hours of confident, deliberate walking, and an eventual return to the exact starting point, despite every reasonable law of geometry insisting that shouldn't be possible. Always, without exception, when hiking that specific stretch of trail completely alone. None of us have ever found an explanation that satisfies the actual physics of it, and I've noticed, reading through those replies more than once since, that every single person who described it, myself included, mentioned the same detail almost as an afterthought, that the forest had felt, in some way none of us could fully articulate, like it was paying close, deliberate attention the entire time.
I was camping alone in a state forest for a full weekend, tent pitched deliberately about a quarter mile off the main marked trail for the sake of quiet, and at nearly midnight on my second consecutive night out there, I heard my own full name called, clearly and unmistakably, from somewhere out in the trees beyond my campsite, in my mother's exact voice, the specific pitch and cadence she uses when she's calling me in for dinner from the backyard. A voice I have heard my entire life and would recognize anywhere, except my mother was, at that exact moment, 340 miles away at her own home, a fact I confirmed by calling her the second I got cell signal the following morning, waking her up at 6 a.m. in genuine confusion about why her daughter was calling to ask if she'd been anywhere near a specific state forest the night before. I really need to explain clearly how completely certain I was that it was actually her exact voice, because I think that certainty is the entire point of this story. I wasn't half asleep. I wasn't drifting into a dream state where sounds get distorted and misremembered. I was fully awake, sitting fully upright in my sleeping bag, quietly reading by headlamp, simply because I couldn't manage to fall asleep yet, when I heard it, my full name, called once, in a voice carrying my mother's exact, unmistakable inflection on the second syllable of my own name, the way she's always slightly emphasized it since I was a kid. A detail specific enough that I don't think anyone who's never actually heard my mother say my name could have replicated it by accident. Before I tell you what I did after I heard it, and I want to be honest that what I almost did next is the part of this story that scares me more in hindsight than the voice itself, I want to ask you something. If you heard a parent's voice, unmistakably, clearly calling your name from dark woods, where you knew for a fact they couldn't possibly be, would you go look, or would you stay exactly where you were? I need you to actually think about that before you answer, because I didn't get it right the first time, and I want to know if you would have. Drop your honest answer in the comments, and subscribe if you want to hear the story that made me finally understand what I'd actually heard that night. Now, what I almost did. I called back once, without thinking, the word coming out before I'd made any conscious decision to answer. Coming, the same single word I've reflexively called back to that specific voice since I was maybe 6 years old, and my body was already halfway out of my sleeping bag before the rest of my brain finally caught up with what I was actually doing, unzipping my tent, headlamp already in hand, some deep instinctive part of me responding to that voice the exact way I've responded to my mother calling me my entire life, immediate, unquestioning, before the rational part of my mind fully registered how impossible the situation actually was. I had one foot outside the tent, cold ground under my sock, when the voice called my name a second time, closer now, from a slightly different angle than the first call had come from. And something about that specific shift, the fact that whatever was calling me had moved position between calls, finally broke through the automatic response my body had been running on, because my actual mother, standing still in one spot calling for me, would never have needed to relocate between two calls spaced maybe 15 seconds apart. I zipped my tent bag shut, sat in the center of it with my knees against my chest, and did not sleep again for the remainder of that entire long night, sitting perfectly still and listening as my name got called 4 more distinct times over the following hour from 4 different positions that seemed to be slowly, deliberately circling my campsite at a consistent distance, never coming closer, never receding further, just moving patiently around the perimeter of where I was hiding, in a voice that never once broke character, never once slipped out of my mother's exact tone, even as the position shifted, until sometime around 2 a.m. it simply stopped, all at once, and the forest went back to its normal, ordinary nighttime sounds, wind, insects, nothing that sounded like anyone's voice at all. I stayed sitting upright in that tent, wide awake, until the very first gray hint of dawn, and packed up and hiked out the moment there was finally enough light to see the trail clearly and safely. And when I mentioned the experience, cautiously, to a park ranger at the entrance station on my way out, she didn't seem surprised, told me quietly that they get variations of that same report a few times every season, always a voice the camper knows intimately, always called from just beyond the edge of a campsite, and that the department's unofficial, never formally published guidance to rangers who hear about it secondhand is to simply tell campers, as gently as possible, to never leave a tent at night, no matter how convincing or how heartbreakingly close the voice sounds. She told me one more thing before I got back in my car, something she said wasn't official policy either, but had become a kind of quiet rule among longtime rangers at that station, that the reports always, without exception, involve a parent's voice specifically, never a sibling, never a friend, never a partner, always a mother or a father, and that nobody on staff had ever been able to explain why, beyond the working theory, never confirmed, that whatever does the calling seems to specifically target the one voice a person is genetically, instinctively wired to respond to without a moment of hesitation or doubt. The voice that got you fed and picked up and comforted before you were old enough to question anything at all.
I've hunted that same remote section of national forest for well over 20 years at this point, and 2 seasons ago, cutting cross-country through an area of thick, tangled underbrush I genuinely, honestly never once walked through before, despite close to 2 full decades of hunting that same mountain. I found a genuine wooden cellar door, the old-fashioned heavy angled kind you'd expect to see leading down into a root cellar or a storm shelter on some long-abandoned farm, built directly into a low, earthen mound rising unnaturally out of otherwise flat forest floor in the middle of forest that showed no other sign, anywhere nearby, of a homestead, a foundation, a well, or any structure that would explain why an underground storage space would have been dug at that specific spot decades, or possibly a century ago. And when I knelt down and pressed my bare hand flat against that door's weathered wood, on a cold November morning, with frost still on the ground around it, the wood was distinctly, unmistakably warm, warmer than the air, warmer than the frozen ground surrounding it, as though something below it was actively generating heat. I want to be clear about how remote this location actually was, because it matters for how strange the whole discovery felt in the moment. This wasn't near any old logging road or historic settlement marked on any map I'd ever seen for that mountain. It was deep, difficult terrain, the kind you only end up walking through by accident while tracking game off an established trail, over a mile from the nearest fire road, and in 20 years of hunting that exact section, I had never once come across any indication, foundation stones, an old fence line, anything, suggesting a homestead had ever existed anywhere near that spot. Before I tell you what I actually did with that door, because I want to be honest that what I did next probably wasn't smart, I want to ask you something, because I think your answer says a lot about how you'd have handled it yourself. If you found an unexplained cellar door, warm to the touch, in the middle of remote forest, with no structure anywhere nearby to explain it, would you open it, or would you walk away and never come back? Think about that honestly before you answer, and tell me in the comments, because I've gotten wildly different responses every time I've asked this, and I want to know exactly where you land. Subscribe if you want to hear what I found when I finally worked up the nerve. Now, the door itself. I sat back on my heels a good distance from it at first, just looking, letting the strangeness of it actually settle in before I let myself get any closer. And it was close to 20 minutes before I finally crossed that distance and did anything at all, running my hand slowly along the weathered wood, checking the hinges, which were old iron, rusted heavily but clearly still functional, and a simple wooden latch holding it shut rather than any kind of lock, meaning whoever had built it either never worried about anyone finding it out there or hadn't visited it in so long that securing it further had simply stopped mattering. When I finally lifted the latch and pulled the door open, the hinges gave a long, low groan that felt, in that specific silent forest, considerably louder than it probably actually was. And below it, instead of the small dirt-floored root cellar I genuinely expected, a set of wooden steps descended down further into the dark than my flashlight beam could fully reach or illuminate, into a space that was unmistakably considerably warmer than the November air around me, warm enough that I could actually see faint condensation forming along the underside of the door itself as it swung slowly, fully open in front of me. I did not go down those steps, not that day and not ever, and I want to be honest that a large part of that decision was pure, practical, deeply ingrained hunting instinct, rather than anything I could have fully articulated in the moment. An animal den doesn't announce itself with a cellar door, and something inhabited by an actual person doesn't typically sit unexplained and unmarked a mile deep in national forest, with no trail leading to it, meaning whatever was actually generating that specific warmth below me simply didn't fit cleanly into any category my full 20 years of hard-earned experience in those woods had prepared me to reasonably assess. I closed the door, latched it exactly as I'd found it, and hiked out considerably faster than I'd hiked in, marking the general location in my GPS, but deliberately not marking it precisely, a decision I made in the moment and have never fully second-guessed since. I went back once, about 4 months later, in early spring, specifically to see if I could relocate it, spent the better part of an entire full day carefully searching the general area as closely and thoroughly as my rough GPS marking actually allowed, and never found it again. No mound, no door, no disturbed earth suggesting one had ever been there at all. Only dense, undisturbed underbrush, exactly like every other unremarkable stretch of forest surrounding it, as though the ground itself had simply closed back over whatever I'd found. And this is the possibility that actually keeps me up at night more than the warmth ever did, as though it had simply, deliberately chosen not to let me find it again. I mentioned it to a retired Forest Service employee I know through a hunting group I've been part of for years, mostly expecting him to have some grounded, practical explanation involving old mining claims or forgotten homestead records, and instead he went quiet for a moment, in a way that told me before he even spoke that this wasn't going to be the mundane answer I was hoping for. He told me that section of the Forest Service's own old survey records, going back decades before either of us had ever set foot on that mountain, included several handwritten notations, never fully explained in any official document he'd ever seen, marking specific coordinates across multiple different tracks as structure, unconfirmed, do not approach after dark, a phrase he said he'd personally seen on at least 4 separate old survey maps over his career, and had never once found anyone still working who could tell him what it actually referred to, or why the structures those notations pointed to had never once, in all the years since, been formally located, documented, or explained.
3 people, 3 forests, and the same quiet, unsettling thread underneath all of it. That the wilderness we assume follows fixed, predictable rules, direction, distance, what's actually buried beneath the ground, sometimes simply doesn't. And whatever benefits from those rules bending has been doing it a lot longer than any of us have been out there to notice. If you've ever gotten turned around somewhere that shouldn't have been possible to get lost in, heard something call to you in a voice it had no right to have, or found something in the woods that didn't add up no matter how you looked at it, this is exactly the kind of story this channel exists to collect. Tell me what happened. In the comments, no detail too strange, because the strangest details are usually the ones that end up connecting to somebody else's story in ways neither of you expected. Subscribe if you're new here, because this channel only grows through people deciding a story like this is worth passing along. And the next time you're deep in the woods and your compass, your gut, or a voice you know by heart is telling you something that doesn't add up, trust the part of you that wants to turn back, because the forest is very patient and it is in absolutely no hurry at all.